What was it like for the first generation of women who entered the clergy? The Jewish Reform movement believed in the full equality of women and our rights to be leaders in all aspects of our faith. But when women began to enter the profession in the 1970s, we were faced with a whole host of challenges which hampered our ability to fully live out our calling. How did it feel to break that stained glass ceiling? Today I will interview Barbara Ostfeld, the first ever ordained female cantor. She will talk about her unique journey and what inspired her to pursue this path. She will talk about her book Catbird, the Ballad of Barbi Prim, in which she details her personal struggles and the numerous unique experiences she had as she forged a new path over the course of her career. Welcome to Spiritually Speaking. Barbara, it is a joy and a pleasure to have you here today, and I'm so thrilled that you came all this way to be interviewed for our program. So I wanted to start off by asking a question which a lot of people, I'm sure, would like to know the answer to. What does a cantor do?
The vehicle through which the cantor expresses herself is music. And so there's a lot of singing involved, a lot of teaching involved, a lot of talking and hand-holding involved. And if you have a passion for Judaism and you like to sing, it's for you.
So you would lead the musical portions of a worship service, for example, on all the holy days and on Shabbat, and also teach kids music. Is that true?
During worship, the prayers that are there in Hebrew and in English, the cantor would sing those and enable the congregation to sing along. It's not just the cantor singing, but that it's everyone singing, praying, communicating at the same time. And sure, there's a lot of work with young people, teaching them Jewish music and preparing them to become bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, which means teaching them to chant passages from the Bible in Hebrew and according to the very fancy little signs that indicate melody, which are sort of a precursor of notes as we know them. So it's like a special code that cantors know and that they teach, and it's fun. It's like teaching a puzzle.
You are the first ever female cantor, which is a great honor. Could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to become a cantor?
When I was a little girl, I loved going to temple, and I loved the rabbi and the cantor of my childhood congregation. I was happy when I was in temple, and I joined the children's choir as soon as I was old enough. By the time I was 8 years old, I really wanted to be a cantor when I grew up. I wanted to do the things that the cantor of my childhood congregation did, and be with the children the way he was, and shake hands the way he did, and hold the Torah scroll the way he did, and read from the Torah the way he did. I wanted to do all of those things, and I wanted to, in particular, nod yes when the rabbi was talking about civil rights. It made me feel important, and when I read along with the congregation responsively, it felt important and serious and good to me.
And did you think, and I know people ask me this question also, did you think when you were growing up and decided you wanted to become a cantor that there were no female cantors?
It didn't cross my mind at all until I called Hebrew Union College and asked for an application. When I did that, I was told by the registrar that no girl had ever asked for an application before, and I was like, what? Because it seemed so logical to me. But in fact, I hadn't been aware that there weren't women who were ordained as cantors. And so I entered a program, a 5-year program at Hebrew Union College, which trained me to be a cantor. And it was mostly learning about all things Jewish, learning about all kinds of Jewish music, and how to listen with a Jewish ear, and how to speak with a particular Jewish mouthpiece. It was 5 long, exciting, scary years.
And you didn't go to college, actually. You went right from high school.
It was permissible then to enter the cantorial program at Hebrew Union College right from high school. So a number of us were kids when we entered the school. Very shortly thereafter, it became a master's program, and that, of course, significantly raised the level of the profession.
So what were the challenges that you had being in cantorial school as the only woman in the whole program?
I was afraid initially that the Orthodox professors would find my presence problematic, since up until my time they had only taught men. But in fact, it was not a problem, and even the most observant of my professors were happy to teach me and believed that Jewish thought led them to open up and to be liberal and to teach women alongside men. The challenges, I was supposed to lip sync for a year during the choir sessions. So both when we rehearsed and when we performed, I was lip syncing so that I wouldn't mess with the male choir sound, which was so, magnificent, but they didn't want to adulterate it with a higher pitched voice. The other challenge was that I was lonely. I didn't have any female companionship, and although I had great relations with the male students, I didn't have that closeness, that ability to exchange inner thoughts with the men. I mostly functioned as their babysitter, since many of them were considerably older and had little kids.
Did people from the outside want you to come and speak or sing or whatever because you were such an oddity?
Yeah. Once I was ordained, I had a lot of requests from synagogues all over the country. They wanted to hear what I had to say, but mostly they wanted to hear me sing. And what was that going to be like? They'd only heard male cantors before me.
And so after you were ordained, where did you go from there?
A year after I was ordained, I interviewed for a position on Long Island at Temple Bethel of Great Neck, which was a huge congregation, very cutting edge. So they were kind of jazzed about having the first woman cantor as their cantor. But it was a high-pressure position, and I was very young and very new. Nowadays, it's the case that a student can't come right out of school into a big fancy pulpit. The new graduate has to learn the ropes first. But back then, it was sort of trial by fire, and I got burned. But nevertheless, I persisted.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got burned?
Because there had been no women cantors before me, and because there were only a very few women rabbis, I really didn't know how to comport myself. I was kind of making it up, so it was a combination of imitating male cantors and trying to be the kind of woman/leader that I imagined would be suitable. So I had all these made-up rules about how I had to act and look and behave, and so I sort of kept myself in this very narrow place so that I felt comfortable functioning. And I didn't want anything to be natural or earthy or imperfect. So I walked a very narrow line, and I learned gradually that I could just be a real person doing this holy work as myself.
And I knew you from back then.
I know.
And I know you were extremely beloved at that congregation, and I think to this day that they have very, very fond memories of you. And I remember how you were one of the most popular clergy there all the time. So you succeeded beautifully. I'm wondering if there were instances that you felt uncomfortable with members of the congregation because they didn't know how to treat you. Because I had similar situations, so I'm just wondering if you did as well.
I remember one year on the high holy days when rabbis and cantors wear long white robes. I was wearing a gray skirt that came a little bit below my robe, So there was a lot of critique in the ritual committee meeting about how the Cantor's skirt was longer than her robe and that her shoes had a stack heel and that was too casual for the high holy days.
The same thing happened to me. After my second week, there was a critique on the part of one of the older men that I wore the same pair of shoes 2 weeks in a row.
Scandalous.
Scandalous.
My mother had made all my clothes so that when a dress was too old to be worn as a dress anymore, she would cut it off and it would be a blouse. So I would wear a blouse like that and a skirt and very little makeup. So a group of women decided that I needed to have a makeup job and buy all these products. They took me shopping so that I would buy suits with scarves, and I was like, I'm in my 20s, I'm not going to wear a scarf. I don't want to be accessorized and made up. So at one point I kind of looked like a creature with orange foundation and glittery eyeshadow, and it didn't work for me, so I kicked it to the curb.
How did that feel when these women were taking you shopping and trying to create their image of what you should look like?
It felt weird, and it also made me feel even younger than I was. Here were these women who were acting in some kind of maternal role toward me and guiding my choices of clothing and hair. I was worried at the time, and I was constantly anxious that I wasn't presenting in a way that would reflect well on the congregation and the Jewish people. And so I worried all the time about how I was coming across. So I think I was a little nervous all the time until I learned that the Eternal One created all of us to be who we are and to work toward being our best selves, and that didn't involve hair, makeup, or clothing.
But when you decided to just be your own person, was the congregation was okay with that?
Interestingly, yes. When I learned to walk, talk, and dress like me, I think a layer of a barrier sort of evaporated, because one doesn't need to pose on top of a pedestal in order to be a good clergy person.
And there was a huge double standard there. I know in my first congregation, when I was an assistant rabbi, the congregation, my biggest critique was that I did not dress and look like the women in that community. And I can't imagine that if you were male, any of that would have happened.
I think with a male cantor, so long as he's not wearing some bizarre tie, and so long as his hair isn't out to here, he's probably going to be fine. But for women, the standard was very high, and we learned to conform or not.
I know in my first congregation also, people treated me very weirdly. Like I remember when every time I would walk into the sanctuary, people would be whispering, "There's the woman rabbi."
Yeah.
Did that happen to you?
So much of the time, I would hear in Long Island accents, "The Cantor is a girl. Did you see the Cantor? She's a girl." And that made me feel horrible. In addition to which, I had to learn how to shake hands in a particular way, because I was worried about being kissed on the cheek. So I would sort of stiff arm my handshake and indicate in that way that I had a certain dignity that was not to be penetrated.
Where were you when you had your kids?
I adopted my older daughter from Bogota, Colombia, when I was still in Great Neck. We adopted our second daughter from the same orphanage 3 years later. And so I was in Great Neck with two very little girls.
When I had my son, I know there was some controversy about how much time I was spending as a rabbi versus how much time I was spending as a mother. I don't know if that came into play for you.
It did, and again, you were asking earlier about our male colleagues. I don't think many congregants would ask how much time a male rabbi or cantor was spending with his children as opposed to in his synagogue.
There were no role models
No.
for how to be a mother and a cantor or a rabbi.
No, and I really did not do well in that department. I was so concerned about being a good cantor and sort of holding up the dignity of this ancient profession. Knowing that I was the first woman, I felt as though I had to be perfect. Everyone was looking at how I did it, and so that made me feel anxious all the time. And I think that I paid less attention to my children than I should have, so that the congregation got all the benefit of what I had to offer, and my children got a little less than they might have. And so I've always been apologetic about that since.
And I know it's hard because being a rabbi or a cantor, you have the opposite schedule that one should have as a parent, because your major working hours are after school when your kids are around, or in the evening when your kids are around.
My older daughter in particular wished that I had been driving carpools like other mommies, and of course I couldn't. I was teaching, preparing children to become bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, or running children's choir. And then on the weekends, when normal families get to hang out and do family things, I was, as you were, in synagogue and in religious school, so that our weekend activities were attenuated and the kids were shortchanged.
What years were you there, and how long were you there in Great Neck?
I spent 12 years in Great Neck. I was there from 1976 to, if I can do the math, 1988. And then I moved to Western New York, and I served a congregation in Rochester for a couple of years, and then finally made my home in Buffalo, New York. The atmosphere in the Buffalo area, the Western New York area, is more casual. I learned to breathe a little more deeply, relax a little bit more, and of course part of that was just that I was getting older and smarter. So I spent 12 years at Temple Beth Am in Williamsville, New York, which is a suburb of Buffalo. So that was the last part of my cantorial pulpit career.
And then what happened after that?
I became the placement director of the American Conference of Cantors. So what that meant was that I was making matches between congregations and cantors all over the country. And that was fascinating work. I loved working with the lay leaders and with rabbis of various stripes.
If you had this to do over again, what might you have done differently?
I would have entered psychotherapy while I was a cantorial student, so that I could have sort of parsed my experiences week by week and had someone reflect back with me and focus my thinking on how to go through learning this career. In addition, I think I would be less concerned about how I appeared and more concerned about how I functioned in the workplace. I also think that I would have spent more time with my children, more time raising them. I would have reserved more evenings so that I could have read to them and sung them lullabies, as opposed to being at meeting after meeting, night after night.
So you would have kind of put your foot down more and said, like, sorry, like this is family time, or these are family nights.
Perfect point, because I think I was afraid to put my foot down, lest people think, oh, the woman cantor is, not warm, welcoming, or malleable. I thought I had to be eternally flexible, ready to shift on a dime, so that I could be all things to all people and therefore be a good cantor. And now I realize that a person can be a good cantor and also true to his or her own personality.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about your amazing book that you wrote, Catbird, the Ballad of Barbi Prim, and what inspired you to write this book?
Even when I was a little girl, I kept journals, And so at particular crossroads in my life, I found it cathartic to write things out, and when the computer came along, to type things out. So I had all these little notebooks, and there were such interesting stories that I collected across the years that I thought, oh, I should write a book. Everyone thinks that, and most people should write a book. But I actually set out to do that, and it took me almost 11 years to translate my scribbles and my notebooks into a book that actually, you know, has themes that move forward and characters that can be followed. And it was great fun, but a great challenge. And I worked with a wonderful editor.
What do you want people to get out of the book?
The main message of the book is that you can move from a place of anxiety and tension to a place of real joy and internal peace if you do the work.
When I read the book, I was just fascinated by some of the stories that, even though we were friends, I had no idea a number of the things that happened to you, and which were kind of shocking for me. One thing that I got from the book that I hope others do as well is what challenges we women had to face from others in the community and in school and in congregations and outside of congregations, that just how vulnerable particularly the first generation of women clergy were.
We were making it up as we went along. We were improvising, as we would say in music, and we learned what worked and what didn't, what felt natural and what felt artificial. And so picking and choosing our way through our professional lives, we developed some kind of system, each one of us, that works for each one of us. We are now the majority. There are more women in the liberal Cantor today than there are men. And so we are not only no longer an oddity, we are the mainstream now.
What do you think are some of the lessons of your career?
What I learned is that it's important to sing in your own voice, that everyone needs to find his or her own voice and then to use it. Imitating someone else in an attempt to fill a certain position is not going to serve anyone well.
What are you doing now, and how does what you're doing now relate to what you're being a cantor?
I do a lot of reading, and I'm aware that in each of my encounters with people, whether I'm holding the door for somebody who's going into the grocery store, or retrieving something that an older person has dropped on the floor and can't quite get, that in each interaction in my day, I want to be the best version of myself that I can be, and in that way, be a good Jew and a good cantor.
It was a pleasure for me to mature into becoming a rabbi with you as my role model when I was in my later years in school and in the beginning of my career, and we kind of lost touch over the years, but we had so much fun hanging out on the Upper West Side together during those years, and I'll always remember those fondly, and I'm really glad that we reconnected, and I was thrilled about your book, which I hope everybody has a chance to read, because it really it's an amazing story of how you evolved into the person that you became today. So I'm very proud to know you.
Thank you, Susan.
So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to reading more and learning more about you and watching you continue to evolve as a person in the years to come.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.